Welcome to Mechs on Deck, episode 13, I believe.
Lucky number 13.
Today we've got Chewy back in house, and we have a special guest from Top Clack, Quakemz.
Hello.
Welcome.
Thank you for having me, both of you. I appreciate it.
Of course, man. Glad to have you.
Excited to be here.
Yeah, today we are talking about switch modding, doing different things. We're going to go through lubing, spring swapping, switch filming, housing, changing that up, and then changing up your stems as well. But first, we're going to do kind of what's on your desk. So
I'll start us off. I built this board on stream a few weeks ago. Nothing people haven't seen already. TX60, gray, HHKB layout. Holy Trash Pandas or Holy Raccoons, whichever one you want to call it. 70 gram TX springs. I did the whole the oil on them. Really liking them for a switch that I'm usually the springs. That's pretty light for what I prefer. But yeah, Holy Trash Pandas, they're great, very tactile. I do have a 78 gram spring in the space bar though, because I felt like it wasn't resetting fast enough for me. But just something different. But yeah, I just pulled this out today and started using it. I'll probably use it for the rest of this week.
Nice. Am I going next here?
sure,
Okay.
you can.
Okay. So I have a TGR 910 RE. This is the RE aluminum edition, which is pretty rare. Usually it's the polycarbonate edition, as you can see there. It says RE. So I'm building this actually for a customer. I did that on stream yesterday. But I'm just doing a little polishing up, little finishing touches, making sure every switch is aligned perfectly and everything feels consistent and good and even before I send that back out. So that's what I'm typing on at the moment.
Getting it fancy
Yeah.
with the TGR board. I'm also, just like Chewy, on a TX60, still just rocking the TX60 with the 67 gram Zelios with JTK purple on white. It's my gaming board. I love it. Feels great. Sounds good.
Nice.
I feel like if you're from
Yes.
Texas, you have to have a TX board. I mean, come on.
Okay, that's. I'm gonna choose not to accept that. But I feel like, all joking aside, I feel like the TX60 is a really good benchmark board.
It is.
Just like all TX boards in general, they have a really good job with consistency. It's a pretty good product.
Yeah, they're great, like mid high end, like that kind of, they fit that niche, especially like obviously now they're not as readily available as they were 6-9 months ago, but for a long time they were pretty easily accessible, and you can still get them on Mech Market for a pretty good price.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So, what are we talking about?
Yeah, I think the first step in terms of switch modding, just lubing. So what's kind of y'all's your first step when you're going to lube, and what's your kind of reasoning behind lubing your switches?
So I'll take the first stab at this. The biggest one personally is kind of taking care of factory issues. That they do come. A lot of switches do come, kind of pre-lubed or factory lubed, but they're not always consistent, and sometimes they are just a little scratchy, and a lot of it's lubing just to kind of further increase the smoothness of it, because if you've typed on a lubed switch versus an unlubed switch, and you kind of feel that scratchiness, it's kind of one of those things that once you feel it, it never really goes away, to me at least. Like once you type on it, you're like, oh, okay, well, now this is kind of ruined for me. But just helping smooth out those issues, because they can, especially on maybe some cheaper switches, they can have issues straight from the factory that, if every switch was lubed perfectly right from the factory, every switch would be $2 a switch, because they just can't do it perfectly. So I think, to me, the first most important thing to lubing is fixing those issues right out the gate.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, lubing has kind of been something I've been doing for a few years now. I've been dabbling in it for a fair amount of time, and I feel like I'm relatively experienced in it. I even have a guide up on my website, topclack.com, with kind of, it's a little outdated right now, actually, now that I think about it, but it's generally most of my process. And yeah, like you said, a lot of switches coming straight from the factory with a little bit of lube on it. It's often not nearly enough and not very well applied, has been my general experience with it. So that's why people like me and you and lots of others in our community choose to just lube them ourselves. Obviously, it takes a lot of time. It's a lot more work, but the payoffs can be pretty darn huge.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you take something like the recent switch, the Novel Keys cream switch is kind of like, to me, one of the poster childs of a switch that needs to be lubed, but goes from kind of a mediocre to like, holy crap, this switch is amazing. And once I typed on them for a little bit just to kind of get the feel, I was like, I don't really, it's not anything to write home about. And then once you lube them, it's like, oh, okay, like we're in business now. I see it. I feel it now. Like it's just something that can take a switch to the next level on something that, outside of buying lube, but just putting some elbow grease into it can take a switch from, an okay switch to an amazing switch. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think lubing really changes the entire characteristic of a switch. It makes it feel much more pleasurable to type on. Obviously when you're looking at lubing, you want to make sure you have a good consistency and everything, so that you're not like going crazy with it. And you're not just like completely ruining the switch. But speaking of that, what's kind of the drawbacks to doing some things your first time lubing, or maybe you've only lubed a couple switches, or the differences when it comes to lubing linears versus like tactile switches?
Well, I think,
yeah.
Sorry, Chew, you go.
No, you go. I was going to say, you talk about linears for sure, because I don't have that much experience with linears.
Sure. So I think just lubing switches in general your first time can be a little overwhelming, and a lot of people maybe don't do it quite so well. So that's why I try to veer people in a specific direction to where they can be a little bit more set up for success. So I've noticed what a lot of new lubers do, and even people that have been lubing for a while, is they'll actually use a lot of lube, like way more than I would feel comfortable using and feel is necessary. And this is kind of a problem I've been having with people lately. They just kind of slop on a bunch of lube, and it doesn't feel that great. It feels a little mushy. It feels a little inconsistent. It sounds kind of awkward at times. And it's kind of a bummer, because overlubing switches, I think, is the number one mistake that almost everyone makes. And I say this based on my kind of benchmark for how much lube to use. Obviously, it's all going to be preference in the long run. You want to use a ton of lube, cool. You want to use a little bit of lube, cool. You want to use a really thick lube, cool. If you want to use a little thin oil, whatever. Like, everyone has their own preferences, but I do feel that the proper way to lube switches, and this is how I prefer them, is to keep the natural characteristics of the switch itself and just make it better, as opposed to what a lot of people do when they overlube and every switch kind of feels the same, especially with our community being the way it is right now and transitioning more over from oils to where almost everyone exclusively uses grease now. Tribusys 3204s and Krytox 205 grade 0, obviously probably the two most popular lubes on the market right now and have been for well over a year. Both of those are relatively heavy greases, and with the new Cristo lineup from Novel Keys, those are all greases as well. So I feel like oil is definitely my preferred lube. Krytox GPL 105 and GPL 104 are probably my two absolute favorite lubes right now, because I feel like they do a better job of preserving the switch itself and not actually changing it into something that it's not, or making it feel like other switches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you're exactly right, especially on something like a tactile, where like you want to preserve that bump. There's a big reason that most people go into tactile switches is for the bump and the feel of the bump, whether it's, a rounded kind of larger bump or a sharper one, kind of like a box royal or something like that, where you want to preserve that. So if you over lube, that immediately starts going away. And, and even picking the right lube, can be a hard time, especially with tactiles, where if you pick the wrong one, you can't do 205 on a tactile, or it's just going to turn into a bad linear switch. So, making sure you pick the right lube is great. And then just making sure, like you said, try and just improve the switch. Don't make something new is brilliant. And, that's something that, less is more. It can be used there, because it just like, you don't need, from my, I've over lubed switches, and it's such a terrible feeling when you're just like, well, I did a bad job and I spent too much.
We've all been there.
Yeah. And it's not fun, and it's hard to de-lube switches. I've never even really tried it.
It's not fun, especially, actually, fun fact, a lot of people don't know this, but most lubes, particularly Krytox, are actually designed to not be dissolved by rubbing alcohol, isopropyl alcohol. So when you try to use that to remove it, it doesn't always work properly, and it gets really, really messy. So oftentimes what I'll do, I've only ever had to do this one or two times, is I'll just start from scratch. I'll just start with a new batch. I just consider those switches dead.
Yep.
And I'll just move on.
So, and I think one thing that really helps, this is something that I do, I've streamed my last couple lubing times, but typically I don't even know how much longer I'm going to be streaming lubing, because that's just a hassle.
Yeah, I stopped doing that a while ago. Nobody likes watching that. Nobody likes doing it.
Yeah, and it's just, it's one of those things where you have to be focused on something. It's kind of like soldering. During the soldering part, it's a lot harder to stay focused on something else while you're streaming. So, but I only do about 20 switches at a time, because, if you think about it, a switch can take about close to 2 minutes each, if you're really making sure you're trying to do it consistently. And if you're doing 60, I usually do 64 switches for 60%. That's over 2 hours. And so I usually try and break it up. So I would really suggest, spending a couple minutes on 2 or 3 switches and getting them exactly how you want, and then try and lube about 20 and then compare it to that one, and then take a break. Because what's going to happen is you'll get, you're going to start getting fatigued, and you're going to get tired, and you're going to get impatient. And this is spoken from personal experience and with other people I've talked with, where you just get impatient, and then you start making mistakes. So the first 30 or 40 switches are great, and then you have 20 that are terrible, or either over-lubed or under-lubed. And so I would highly recommend, take your time, because, at the end of the day, unless you're in some huge rush to get it done, there's never really a time that you need to be panic lubing. So
exactly. And that's one of the things I like to tell people when they ask what they need to be successful at lubing. And I'm like, set aside way more time than you think you're going to need.
Absolutely.
You want to clean an open workspace. Excuse me, guys. Sorry. Clean an open workspace, and you want to just have way more time than you think you'll need. You never want to try to rush lubing, especially if you're new at it. I would say that a converse point to doing them in stages is that, and I have done them that way, totally. I still do them that way sometimes, but lately I've been trying to do them kind of all in one go, because I feel like I get more kind of in this zone. And this is another reason I don't like to stream while I do it, because I feel like to be really successful at streaming while you're leaving switches, you have to be really, really interactive with chat and basically not stop talking. And if you're not doing that, then the stream is pretty boring to watch. But at the same time, you got to give all of your attention to the switches. Otherwise, like you said, you might make mistakes. Yeah, and you don't want that. So I pretty much just sit there silently in my zone, and then I just kind of zen out and just do them all at once. And I try to get them as good as I can, in just one go. So I think either way is fine, and it really just does depend on the person, honestly.
Yeah, I think it's what allows you to get into that zone to where you can be consistent. If it's doing them all in one go, then that's could be what's for you. Or if it's like doing them in smaller batches, that could be for you. Just kind of like you said, it's personal preference there. It's just trying to make sure that you're consistent in what you're doing and not like completely forgetting to lube a section or applying way too much to one batch versus the other. Cause then that way you get your switches in your board and all of a sudden like half your board feels all funky.
Yeah. And this is another thing that I've said, if we're in a hobby where, a lot of people have a lot of boards, but a lot of people only need one board. But if you are fortunate enough, I would, and you have kind of a tester board, like we've talked about, maybe a hot swap board, that you can easily swap in and swap out, I would try and, use that and buy more switches than you might need for the actual board in case you have some issues with lubing. And, just try and break them in, because one thing that a lot of people don't know, and I learned the hard way, is I got the holy Jesus switches in, and I lubed them with 3204. And while I didn't over lube them, you will have a break-in period, especially with a thicker lube on a tactile, where you might lose some tactility and it'll be like really smooth, but just know that like it's not going to be this amazing, if you go to a meetup and type there and then go home and go, I'm going to lube switches and they're going to feel just like that. They're not going to. Switches do take time to kind of break in that lube and kind of get it to where it needs to be. So just take time there. I would highly recommend before you solder in switches, if you have the ability to put them in a tester board or a hot swap board so you can evenly break them in, I would definitely recommend doing that too. And where after 2 weeks, pop them all out, shake them in a box, put them all back in, and just kind of keep doing that for a few weeks until you decide to solder them, if you have that luxury.
Yeah, not everyone is quite as fortunate to have break-in boards like we do. Mm-hmm. But you could throw one together with cheap parts. You don't need anything fancy. Just get whatever the cheapest hot swap PCB on the market is. You don't even need to get a plate. You can if you want. It's whatever. Put that in a case, just a cheap tray mount or something, and just go to town. And I kind of do that as well. I have from KBD fans, I have a Tofu win keyless board, which is kind of just like
that is literally the same tester board that I have. Win keyless Tofu.
It's great. It is great. It has an integrated plate. I mean, the design is really simple. USB ports on each side, just in case you need them. And like it comes with a hot swap PCB. Like, what more can you want? Like, easy peasy. It's like $150, which might sound like a lot to some people, but in this hobby, that's about as cheap as it gets.
He says typing on $1,000 plus board.
It wasn't $1,000 at the time. but
True.
If people weren't interested in this kind of thing, they probably wouldn't be watching this kind of video. Let's be fair here.
Yeah. True, very true.
And even if it's your first board, if the Tofu Win Keyless is your first board and potentially your own board, nothing wrong with that. But make sure you take all the switches out and just kind of rebuild it, because especially if you're like a gamer, your WASD keys are going to break in like a week. If you're like heavy gaming, your WASD keys are going to break in really, really fast. Your, top number row outside of like maybe 1, 2, and 3 are going to be basically never used. So just make sure you're rotating them and getting a good, like, healthy rotation of which switches are where, because you don't want to have it to where you're like, oh, this, my WASD type's great. But then when I, am off the game and I have to go do homework or, write an email or something, it's going to feel like garbage because like 7 keys are going to be way different than the others. So,
yeah, one thing that's kind of not in this little sheet we have here, but that I want to kind of ask is what are some tools that y'all like to have, and what are some things you would recommend for making your lubing experience better?
Well, I literally listened to Quakemz talk about what brush he uses, and then I went and told you to get me one of those. So I'll let Quakemz take this one.
I actually have a lot of the pieces that I have next to me. that help a lot. So basically, I'm just going to show off a couple things. One, I think, and a lot of these are not necessarily a necessity, but they can help. So I actually have a switch tray here that is specifically used for switch tuning. It's quite literally just a piece of 3D printed plastic, and it just holds switches. Super thick, it holds switches in there. So basically what I'll do is my process is I actually like to have containers as well. So I have these kind of plastic containers that I use for parts. And what I'll do is I'll set up kind of an assembly line on my desk. So I'll have, one of these trays will be for switch tops. Another one will be for switch stems. And then I usually won't need a third one, but what I'll do is I'll have a dedicated Tupperware container because I tub loop all of my springs now. I don't do it any other way because I find this is just the best and the fastest, and that is value and efficiency, my friends. So I have this tub specifically, and I just reuse this tub for spring lubing, and I use the same lube, and it's just a simple Tupperware tub with a closed lid. Not a big deal. You can find these at all sorts of places, any grocery store, basically. And so I put my springs in this, and then my switch bottoms will go in my station. And then what I'll do is I'll do any kind of tuning on the switch bottoms that I need to do, and then I will tub lube the springs. I just put about 1 to 2 drops, depending on how big the drops are, for each 10 springs. It's always easier to add more than it is to take away. Keep that in mind. So that's the method I use for the springs. I'll put all the springs in, and then I'll move on to my tub of stems, and I'll just do those one at a time. And since I have the tray, it's nice and handy here. It's laying on my desk. You can kind of just leave it set steady there and just put switch parts in one at a time as you need to. And then, close them up with the final bag of tops here. And it's pretty easy. As far as like the rest of the tools, a brush, obviously, is going to be really, really important. Some kind of applicator. I know silicone applicators have been a little bit more popular lately. I haven't tried them, so I don't really know if those are better or worse than a lot of other things in the market. But I've gone through a lot of different brushes, brush styles, and brush sizes. And after about a year or two, I finally settled on this. I don't know if I can... Probably can't see it too well on the camera. This is a Princeton Select Spotter's Point. I like the Spotter's Point. It's a little bit finer, and this is a 5/0 size, which is the perfect size for switch lubing, if you ask me. I see a lot of people using much larger brushes, and it kind of scares me a little bit. Like, if you could lube the entire side of a stem with one brush stroke, that is way too big, and you're applying way too much lube. So that's pretty much all I have, as well as tweezers. Tweezers are your best friend. I have 2 that I use here. One is angled, one is straight. They both have fine tips. I use those to, fish springs out of my spring tub lube thing here, as well as the straight tipped ones I use to hold stems. And all this stuff is pretty cheap too. These brushes are like kind of expensive, quote unquote, at like $5 each. And they'll run me, I'll get a couple 100, 2, 3, maybe 400 switches worth of use out of a brush before I decide I want to change it out. And this, I got a little tweezer kit here. It comes with a bunch of different tweezers. This was like $10 or $15 on Amazon. So it's not too terribly hard to get set up to lube efficiently, I feel like. You just kind of have to, have a few basic, simple, inexpensive tools, and, maybe a guide to go in. I have a guide on my website. There's lots of other guides out there, some of them pretty good. And just more time than you need, and a clean and open workspace. Can't stress that enough. You don't want to be getting dust and dirt and other weird things in your switches while you're lubing them. Got to be clean.
Yeah. Absolutely. And then there was one question I actually saw in our Discord today that someone had asked. What do y'all do to to clean your brush after you've completed your lubing escapade?
You can go.
Okay. Mine's pretty simple. I just clean it with warm water and mild soap, honestly. That's pretty much it. And then I let it dry fully.
Yeah, I don't even go that far, but I don't use a lot of different. If I do use a different lube, then I'll wind up just changing the brush. But a lot of times I just will dry it out some on. I pretty much use the exact same setup, very similar to Quakemz here. I have like a couple napkins that I have out just to make sure I don't have lube getting everywhere. And if I need to like put the brush down, but I'll just kind of clean it with the brush. And then if it's real bad, I'll warm water and then just kind of put it back in I have this little like compartment tray thing where I keep all my switches and all my springs and all that stuff. And I'll just throw it back in there after it's dry for cleaning. So, but,
Nice.
the only other thing that I'll say is, tweezers will help you open up switches, but we also have seen in the last few months, especially like switch openers. Those are extremely handy, I'd say, just because it can be a hassle to open up switches, and especially if it's like a kale style switch, that can be difficult if you're not used to it and you don't have like the swing of it. They have like the little ones. I know there are even some on Mass Drop right now where it's like they have both the MX style and the kale style switch. So a switch opener will save you a lot of time. A lot of headache.
I will say that while it is efficient oftentimes, and some of them are pretty good, tweezers are always still a go-to standard because you're already going to have them if you're using them kind of in our same process of lubing anyways. And I am most of the time I'm just as fast with fine tip tweezers on Kale or MX than I am with my favorite switch opener, which is actually the Key Boss that I'm fastest with.
Yeah, for the longest time I just had a little 3D printed one and but that was only for MX switches. So I used tweezers for Kale up until I have this switch opener for the Kale one, but I haven't actually had to open any Kale switches in a while. So, or at least not like in a mass amount.
Yeah, definitely.
But you'll get a few holes in your fingers. Just don't worry.
Oh yeah,
that's normal. They'll heal.
Yeah, I mean, if you bleed, whatever, it's part of the process. Just don't get it in your switches.
Yeah, blood, sweat, and tears. Come on.
Maybe have some alcohol swabs in case that happens. Keep everything clean.
Yeah.
Nice and sanitized.
Maybe have some alcohol for yourself too. For the pain.
We are not responsible at Mechs on Deck if you accidentally stab yourself seriously.
And always drink responsibly.
Yes, always drink responsibly. Right. Maybe don't drink and lube at the same time. Keep a clear head.
Yeah. Who knows? Maybe some people enjoy that. That's a nice Friday night. Get yourself a nice glass of scotch and some lube.
I don't know where this is going, man.
I was like, this sounds like it's going in a really weird direction.
I think I like where this is going either way, though. So.
It could be entertaining. So is there anything else that y'all would like to add when you're talking about lubing? Any kind of tips and tricks that you'd like to expand on a little bit more?
I like if you can get a 3D printed little switch thing. My camera, of course, just went off right when I started using my hands for gestures. But back on. But if you can get one of those 3D printed little like switch holders things that completely like if you can find one. A lot of people will make them on you can find a lot of people will just make them and just be like, I'm running a quick sale. I think, is it Clavier, whatever his name is. I know he sells them for little switch lubing stations, but I would just highly recommend doing do the base first. You'll be more consistent if you do kind of all the bases first and then all the springs, like Quakemz said, and then all the stems. And you don't try. I've done it where you just do one switch at a time, and after about 10 switches, I was like, this is dumb, and I'm not. It's way more time consuming too. So.
Yeah, and at this point, I've been lubing switches like for so long, and I've lubed so many switches that it's kind of lost its fun. Like, I'll be honest, switch lubing is not fun for me anymore. Whether I'm doing my own switches or someone else's switches, or even if I'm experimenting with new lubes or methods or switch parts, like it's just not fun anymore. Yeah, no,
I totally get. I mean, I have 150 Zelios that I need to lube that I'm just dreading. That's why we talked in our Discord about having a lube party, because it's like at least we can talk, because outside of that, it's like just a hassle.
Yeah, and I've probably done like 2,000 switches in the last like 6 months.
Jeez.
which is
Good Lord.
freaking asinine. And it's not, there's just a turning point where you're like, this is not fun anymore. I don't want to do this. So anytime I can kind of fine tune my method and get it to where I can do it faster, while still retaining the same level of quality that I like, is always a benefit. So anything that helps me in that, like when I discovered tub lubing for the springs, oh my God, my life was changed forever. Because I used to just hand lube springs, and that is so obnoxious. And if you tub lube them, it's like just as effective, if not more. I'd argue it's more so effective, honestly, for the springs in particular. And it takes like 1/10 of the time.
Yeah. Couple minutes.
Good value.
Well, it's like even with those TX springs, and that comes in that little case, and
Drop,
it comes
drop,
with that
drop,
oil.
drop,
You just put the drop of oil on top, and you just let it sit there for a little bit, and then you can come back to it later. It's makes it a lot easier than having to like figure out how you're gonna hold the spring and lube it properly, and
there's springs.
Making it even.
There's springs. They're going to fly everywhere. Like that's always my fear is losing. Like I took for one of my sets of Holy Pandas, I used MX Black springs. I just got them. I bought MX Blacks and then was like, oh, I should try these springs. And so I only had a finite amount of MX Black springs, and I kept flinging them across the room and spending 20 minutes trying to find one spring.
Oh yeah, that's just always going to happen. If you're not fetching at least 16 switch parts and springs off your floor during the process, you're probably doing it wrong.
Well, speaking of springs, we'll kind of move into the next step in your switch modding little guide here, I guess, and that's spring swapping. So how do y'all feel about spring swapping? What are your recommendations?
Well, I'll start this one as well. Quakemz, I don't know how much you've watched, but I am not a fan of light springs. I have beefy fingers and I don't like light springs. So most switches that I will get in, if it's not already basically a Zelio 78, I'm looking to spring swap. So I think, spring swapping adds a lot of different characteristics to springs, especially with tactiles. It can really change the way a tactile switch feels. And so, we do recommend try a lot of different spring weights. It can be a little time consuming, but try a lot, kind of find what's right for you. Cause for me, I know the 70 gram switches I got from TX are probably too light. For me, I prefer something a little bit heavier, but I haven't minded them at all. They've been fun to game on and stuff like that. But, I like a heavier spring. So I know the second I'm going to get them in, I'm going to take all the springs out, put them somewhere. But, if you do find I would recommend, if you do find a switch that you're like, oh, I'm going to spring swap, it could potentially ruin the switch. I bought T1s. I was fortunate enough to get in on them before they sold out in 5 seconds. And I put 78 gram springs in them and they became way worse of a switch. So certain switches just not going to take well to them. But, when it comes to, I can't really, I would have a hard time recommending. I can recommend a brand. If you can find sprit springs, they're kind of hard to find just because they get bought out really quick. But I've liked those. I have nothing against stock Zelio springs. I know some people are kind of on them, but I've liked the TX springs that I've used so far. Of all things, this is no joke though. I don't know what company they get from because they just come in basically just a clear Ziploc bag. But for linears, I only like 80 gram springs, and the only 80 gram springs that I've liked from are the ones that are just MX style springs from KBD fans. And don't know why, but I have them. I had them. I made Telios with them, and I thought they were amazing. Wound up selling that board completely. I had a TR60 that I put Telios in, and then I kind of threw it up for a price to see if someone would buy it, and someone bought it. And so I was like, I bought 80 gram springs from somewhere else, and I was like, this is terrible. I don't know what's going on, but I got them from KBD fans. So even different manufacturing springs are just going to be different. So it's a lot of it is trial and error. But you know, if you can kind of find a weight that you're starting to like, you know that, you know, if you're, that kind of made it easier for me when it comes to like a switch like the Holy Panda, where I knew, okay, I know I'm going to use this exact spring weight because I know I'm going to like this. So I know I like this switch at this weight. And if this is similar, then I know I'm going to at least try it and most likely like it. So.
Yeah, something you kind of alluded to a little bit there is switches feeling different based on the springs that you're putting in them. And what a lot of people don't realize is spring is a lot more than just the weight that it's rated at. So, you know, you'll see 78 gram springs, you'll see 65 gram springs, 62 gram, 63.5, on and on. There's lots of different spring weights, but that's only one factor in determining how a switch is going to feel. Mm-hmm. And that is usually rated by full compression force, meaning that spring is pressed as far down as it can possibly go while it's in your switch. And so that is one determining factor, and a very big one that is quote unquote how heavy your switch is going to be, how it's going to feel. But there's more kind of numerical ratings going on that a lot of people don't take into consideration. So obviously the bottom out weight, the full compression force is important, but how it gets there is, I would argue, equally as important, and sometimes in some cases more important, honestly. So what that means is you'll usually have two numerical ratings to a spring. You'll have an actuation force and the full compression force. And obviously the full compression force, like I just mentioned, is when you fully bottom out your switch with your finger, you're pressing it all the way down as far as it can go. The spring weight that it's rated at is probably what you're going to be feeling, plus or minus a little bit, just because there's always going to be variance. And the actuation is how much weight you need to put on the switch, how much force you need to press it with to achieve the actual keystroke in your operating system. So those numbers are obviously always going to be different. You're always going to actuate the switch at a lesser amount of force than fully compressing it. And, you know, based on the numbers between them is going to be how your switch is actually going to feel overall. So if you have a switch that has a spring, let's say, I'll use a Gateron yellow, for example, because I'm pretty sure I know those figures off the top of my head. I think the actuation force is somewhere around 50 grams, and the bottom out full compression force is about 60 grams. So between actuation and full compression, there's only 10 gram force of gap, which is actually really small. And that's one of the things that makes that switch so popular, is because not a lot of switches do that. Not a lot of switches have that thin of a gap between the actuation and full compression, and it makes it feel really unique. On this opposite side of things, take something like an MX Clear, for example, by Cherry. They have an actuation force of, I think it's either 55 or 65 grams, but the bottom out is almost 100 grams. So instead of having a 10 gram gap between those two figures, you have, you know, a 25 or 30 or 35 or 40 gram gap. And it's much more apparent, and it'll feel like the switch gets heavier overall throughout the press. Whereas on a Gateron yellow, the switch press feels very equal in weighting all the way down. Even though it's not completely equal, it feels much more equal in weighting all the way down. And, you know, depending on what you like, that could be a really big factor for you. And like Chewy had mentioned earlier on tactile switches, that can be a really big deal. So how the spring actually progresses throughout the compression can affect how a tactile switch bump feels. And we saw this in Zelio V1 round 8. When the 67 gram and 78 gram variants from Zeal actually got a spring update, just those two weightings did. And the switch actually felt a lot more tactile, a lot bigger of a bump, and more, it was very obvious, basically. And the only thing that changed was the spring. And, you know, you can see it again in the Halo line of switches, the Halo Clears and the Halo Trues. The only difference between those switches are the spring. Everything else is exactly the same. But when you press them differently, like on a board side by side, you'll notice that they don't feel exactly the same. And it's not just the weight, the actual properties of the bump itself and how obvious it is become really, really apparent when you have springs of different natures like that. So spring properties, really, really, really important. And unfortunately, there's not a whole lot you can do to know about them ahead of time without actually just trying the springs and trying the switches like Chewy mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it can be, you know, the good thing, you know, the plus side is springs are relatively inexpensive. They're like, you can get 100 for like 10 to 12 bucks. They can be harder to find, but they're relatively inexpensive if you want to try them. The downside is if you really want to get the full, experience of typing on this versus that, it can be a hassle of like, okay, well, do I put in like 12 switches and then put in 12 switches of this spring and kind of make this weird mishmash, and then keeping track of them? Or do you just swap the entire switch, which can take a long time of just spring swapping like 65 switches, or even just doing one, but you can't really feel the difference. So it's time consuming, but it can be, I think it's worth it to me, just getting, one or two, but I would highly recommend, this is something that Moon and Osiris talked about last time, where like a meetup can really help, or being able to try multiple boards, because, even something as, it's strange, but something as similar as just like two different linear switches can be completely different feeling on 10 grams of spring weight.
Yeah. So absolutely.
But other than that, I don't, there's not, go for heavier springs. I'm totally kidding. Go with what you prefer, but
yeah, I definitely agree on all fronts. Get out to a meetup and talk to the people whose boards you really, really like, and figure out what they're using, see if they've changed it up. If not, and then like Brian was saying, do your research on the springs and figure out if you have something that you really like, try it in other switches, see how it feels, and it doesn't hurt to try. It might take a little time to get the switch open and swap everything out, but it's worth it if you find something that you really love.
Yeah, you can be as crazy. I know I heard this. I heard you talk about this, Quakemz, the guy that has like whatever finger is supposed to press that switch has this spring weight.
Oh yeah, actually that was fun fact. So that guy is actually Ethan Schoonover, I think is his name, and he is the person that designed the solarized palette. So which we use on key sets like Solarized Penumbra and Solarized Dark or whatever. Yeah, he's like he came to the first Seattle meetup that I organized in 2016. And it was really interesting because he was a very, very meticulous perfectionist kind of guy. And I was talking to him about it, and I was like, man, this board feels really weird to type on. And I mean, a lot of people know that I don't type properly. I kind of just
pinkies
type
out, man.
Yeah, when in doubt, pinkies out. So clearly I'm always in doubt. But so I was typing on his board and I'm like, man, this feels really strange. And he's like, oh yeah, let me show you something. So he took off the caps. And he had different colored switches. So I think he used Gateron switches or something. So he had like Gateron yellows in specific keys, and Gateron reds and other keys, and Gateron blacks and other keys, and Gateron clears and other keys. So he had like the entire linear range of Gateron on display in one board here, basically. And he's like, okay, yeah, so you put these switches on these particular fingers and you type this way, and this is how you get the best ergonomic benefit. And I was like, whoa, man, you're blowing my mind right now.
That's a lot of thought process gone into to one board. That's like a whole nother level of research and figuring out how your fingers would react to different positioning to do something like that.
Yeah. But I mean, it's not totally, something that hasn't happened before. If you look in the past, like Real Force, they have at least in their round one lineup, the RF87U, they have a variable weight version, which, has a combination of 35 gram, 45 gram, and 55 gram domes respectively. So, and they're kind of placed in such a way to where if you type properly, you're supposed to have less fatigue because your weaker fingers are always going to be hitting lighter keys in effect.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense. It's just a lot of work. I guess I'm talking about how it's a lot of work to get a bunch of switches, and we're talking about literally opening switches, applying lube to them, and
yeah. I mean, any kind of switch modification is always going to be a time sink. Like there's no real way to rush it and also have it be done properly. You're just going to have to, especially if you're new, you're just not going to know everything. Mm-hmm. And the only way to know everything is to try everything, and no one's tried everything. So, like you had mentioned, going to a meetup, that is my monumental for new people in the hobby. You go to a meetup, you're going to try so many things, especially if you just, and I don't mean to sound mean about this, but you just ignore people and just type on boards.
Yeah.
Like the entire meetup, if it's 2, 3, 4, 5 hours long, just type on boards the entire time. Bring a notepad. Be that guy. Like bring a notepad and just take notes. Be like, okay, I like this board for this reason. I like these switches for this reason. And talk to the owners, whatever. Be like, hey, how'd you lube these? What springs are you using, etc. Like get as much knowledge as you can, and just positively harass people to get that knowledge that helps you succeed. That's what I did a lot when I was new to the community. I kind of just latched on to like 3 or 4 people, and I was just constantly asking them questions to try to improve myself faster. Yeah. And like you just get hands on with stuff, because there's no other way to learn, and everyone's preferences in this hobby can be vastly different, and no one's necessarily right or wrong. Mm-hmm. So you just have to try things for yourself. So meetups, go to one. And if there isn't one near you, organize one, because there's probably people near you that would also like to do the same thing that you do.
Yeah, because I have 2 TX60s, and it's the same mounting style, and they both have Holy Pandas in them, completely different.
Yeah.
Like I use different lubes. I have different springs. Like it's just lubing and spring swapping turned them into 2 completely different typing experiences. They even sound different. It's crazy. So, but anyway, switch filming. I don't have like any experience switch filming.
I can give you a bit of a rundown if you guys would like. So switch filming is actually a little bit newer, and I say that because switch stickering used to be the thing that the elite high tier enthusiasts used to do with some of their switches. It's not overly popular, at least it didn't used to be. It's a little bit more so now. But the idea is you place a sticker, or in these days, the film is more popular, polycarbonate switch films. Basically what you do is it's a piece of material, whether it's the film or the sticker, that goes in between the top and bottom housing portions of your switch. And you would do this on each switch. And what this does is it adds extra material between the top and the bottom that helps close the tolerances to where it can feel tighter together. And a common misconception is this clears up switch wobble, which is kind of effectively how much play, how much movement your stem has while it's in the actual housing. But it actually doesn't much affect that at all. It affects more the play from the top housing versus the bottom housing. It keeps them together much more effectively, because usually when you type on a normal switch that might not have the greatest tolerances, I'm looking at you, most Gateron switches, and a lot of other switches on the market as well. But they'll have a top that just when you press a key, it kind of moves around a little bit, and that adds to what I would call unsatisfactory noise, and it kind of makes it feel a little bit wider, a little bit not as good, I guess, for lack of a better term. And so we moved into kind of using switch stickers and switch films. Stickers I have used several times before. I'm going to be honest, I don't think switch stickers affect much of anything. I feel like the benefit is negligible, and to the point of where I just won't even sticker switches anymore. However, with the kind of more advancement of the polycarbonate switch films, which are a little bit more popular, a little bit more accessible to people these days, I will say that those are actually pretty beneficial. Not super beneficial. I think it, again, really it's being determined by what switch you're using. Some switches you might not get any benefit from. Some switches might not even be compatible with it because the tolerances are already too tight. Like I know on Zelio V2s, they've actually gotten the tolerances really, really, really tight and really well. And that's what makes it such a successful switch these days. And you can't even really use films on those switches because they're already just too tight. But on some switches that might not have those, you can throw those in and you get a little bit more tightness between the overall housing. And it just gives you a little bit more pleasurable of a typing and audio experience. And I say audio experience in the sense of, people like listening to their switches these days. This didn't used to be a thing. People used to only care about how switches felt. Now it's like, well, how does it sound? How does this switch sound? How does it sound in this board, on this plate material, with this lube and this spring and whatever? There's so many variables that it goes over now. And as I feel like I'm kind of one of the founding fathers of the sound signature being part of the overall experience. Maybe I'm biased and maybe I'm narcissistic and egotistical because, hey, I'm all of those things pretty much. But the sound is such an important part of it. And when you can clean up the sound via lube, via switch filming, via having better or different springs and, other variables going on in your board, it's nice. It's nice to be able to mix things up, and you can get totally different audio experiences as well as totally different feels on your switches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And, just keeping those tolerances tight I think on like the T1s, you can kind of feel that they're not 100% there. And then it's like, I say this a lot, especially when it comes to like unlubed switches or, switches that do have looser tolerance. You can like feel plastic on plastic, and that's not, unless that's what you want. I mean, who knows? But if you can kind of feel that something's wrong, especially if you've typed on a lot of switches and if you've typed on like really nice switches, if you can kind of feel stuff moving and you can kind of hear plastic on plastic, that can really kind of push you in the wrong direction of like, well, I don't really like these because, they're not, they like Zelio V2s are some of my favorite switches because while they don't sound perfect, they feel so good. But, sometimes they are some of the best switches that, don't have like the great, kind of palm sound that everybody loves, or the nylon sound that all these people kind of go after. So, but something where, that's one switch that's accomplished that. So I think trying to, help with sound, but help with feel and help with wobble and help with, or just switch top wobble and all of that is just something that can turn, we talked about with lubing, it can turn a switch, kind of maybe middle of the road, even to a lower end switch, and kind of bring it up to the next tier and really take something for, minimal price and a decent amount of effort to turn something from meh to all right, sweet. So,
yeah. And I tell people this all the time. It's like lubing and like tuning switches doesn't make bad switches good. It makes good switches great.
Yep.
Like you can't always necessarily quote unquote fix a switch that's really bad just by swapping a spring and putting some lube on it or a switch film. It might help, but it's like putting makeup on a pig, right? Like it's at the end of the day, it's still a pig.
It's still a pig.
I mean, the better the switches are that you start with before your tuning process, the better switches you'll get out of it in the long run, in my opinion.
Yeah, totally agree.
All right, so I guess really the next thing is talking about changing out the housing and or the stem, just kind of Franken switching it up.
Yeah, so something with like the bottom of the switch, this is at least what I think. So you can change, a lot of the things you can change in the switch. You can change, if you change the bottom, then you essentially lose kind of what that switch is and what that switch is trying to be. So you can't take something like a Zelio V2 and then swap the bottom with the leaf in it with like a cherry switch. I mean, you can, but then it's no longer a Zelio. It's now become more of a cherry switch. So, but one thing you can do with the housing is you can swap the top part of it. And so, some people might want to swap the top part of it for something that might have a tighter tolerance. We kind of talked about that with switch films, but, you might be able to want something like a tighter tolerance, or you can take a switch that maybe is more of that kind of clear plastic switch, and you can change that to maybe a palm to change like the sound signature just a little bit. And then one thing that I do see a lot is, with a lot of people that come into the community, they come in with, the RGB keyboards, that mechanical keyboards that are sold with, heavy on RGB. So they might change something that's kind of like an all palm housing, or like these Cherry MX switches, and then they put that on top, that clear on top, so you can have a little more light shine through. Because if you get an RGB keyboard and then you put this palm on top, you're going to lose a lot of the light that you get from it. So some people, we're seeing with the new Jesus switches where you put a clear on top, and then that will allow more light to shine through.
Yeah, so a lot of the different parts can come down to the different materials, and obviously you touched on palm a little bit there as well. Palm being kind of a newer material for switch housings, I would say, in the community lately. Previously, it was often more things like polycarbonate, nylon, some kind of blend or composition. They kind of play around with that too. That was a little bit more just a little bit more standard. But you know, a lot of the more opaque matte housings versus the clear translucent housings and stuff, and just the material that it's made up of, can change the way a switch sounds and feels a lot, particularly with the sound. Obviously, palm switches, kind of the new hotness right now, the Novel Keys cream switch. They sound amazing and they feel pretty darn good as well, especially if you're going to be putting the work into them. Definitely pays off. And you know, a lot of people like to think that, let's say, the translucent clear housings on Zelio switches or Telio switches don't sound quite as nice because they're a little bit too high pitched, a little bit too clacky, because they do have that particularly, you know, translucent blend of plastics, and it does seem to let the sound leak out a little bit. Whereas with palm switches or whatever Cherry MX composition plastic uses, tend to be a little bit deeper, a little bit more robust, and a lot of people have been kind of leaning more towards that deeper thock as opposed to the higher pitched clack. And just by toying around with swapping the bottom and or top housings for a switch, you can alter that dramatically. Absolutely.
Yeah. So other than that, I don't really have the most experience with, you know, switching out tops, and that can be a little bit more of like a task. You know, that's kind of being a little more experience into kind of switch modding. So, you know, that's where you kind of have to start buying multiple switches and from multiple places. And, you know, it's just one of those things that it's not very common in our community, but people do it from time to time. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and then I think the best thing is just experimenting, figuring out, just like with all of this, it's really just experimenting, figuring out what you like, figuring out what you think feels good together. You might stumble upon something that's great. And speaking upon stumbling upon something that is great, can we hear a little bit about the Holy Panda and the creation of it from the creator himself?
I'd like to say no, just because I'm honestly very sick of talking about Holy Pandas, but I'll give you the quick rundown. So basically, it was the beginning of 2017, I think, and I had just gotten back from the 2017 Seattle, maybe it was the summer meetup, actually, Seattle summer meetup of 2017, where Hata of Input Club was in attendance, and he had prototypes of the Halo switches, Halo Clears and Halo Trues. They had not yet hit the market yet. And I was there with my, at the time, top Clack co-host, Man of Interest, Huey, who you had on the show recently. And we were both sent home with the Halo Switch prototypes. I think I had the Halo Trues, and he got the Halo Clears. At the time, they both had the same stem. They didn't have different stems like they did once they launched. So it was, you can only tell the difference by actually feeling them. Otherwise, they looked the same. So we both went home with those. And I had recently tried a board from, I don't remember who the user was, but he had Xandas, which was kind of a hybrid switch using Panda housings and Zelio V1 stems. And I tried it and I was like, oh, that's pretty good. That's actually like a better Zelio, basically. It was a more intense Zelio, bigger tactility. So I like that. So I was in the process of making and lubing Xandas myself and I was just at home chilling here, doing it at my desk. And I had the bag of Halo switches, the prototypes, because I had just gotten back from the meetup. Had those just kind of chilling on my desk. And I was like, well, let me see what that's like. That could be interesting. So I put one in and I was like, holy crap, that's ridiculous. And I took apart all the Xandas I had made up to that point, and I just remade them as Holy Pandas, basically. And it was just so freaking good, man. It was so good. And at the time, it was like so revolutionary because nothing else felt or sounded quite like a Holy Panda. Now the Switch market is a little bit more competitive, and I'll be honest, I think the Holy Panda is still very cool and unique, but it's not quite the same awesomeness and level of value that it used to have. But that's pretty much how it started, and then it kind of just became a snowball. I would take the board to various meetups, and I'd have multiple people just being like, "What did you do? How did you make this? What is this? Like, how do I replicate this experience?" I had someone walk up to me at the NorCal meetup in 2017 or 2018, and they just asked to buy the board flat out for like $900, and I was like, no. And this is an Noctuary X60, with some modifications, steel plate, some silencing foam that have the original Holy Pandas in. I still have that board, still built the same way to this day, just as kind of a reference. The original Holy Panda build.
It'll go up in a museum one day.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. I mean, UPS beat it to hell when I shipped it to Mike of Novel Keys. When he shipped it back to me, UPS or USPS was very, very mean about it, and now it has several dents on it, and it's pretty beat up. But the heart and soul is still there. So, I mean, the Switch was incredibly popular at the time, and obviously it's still popular now. As you guys undoubtedly know, it spawned so much drama, much conspiracy, and so many people coming out of the woodwork to talk about this and that. And it's kind of a nightmare. And honestly, it's the Switch is cool, but it's not worth everything that's happened because of it. I mean, especially now that we have Zelio V2s on the market now, which I think is an objectively better Switch. Mm-hmm. In terms of consistency and feel. But so it's like, I don't know. I hope it dies down soon because it's just not worth it right now.
Yeah, I think it has kind of died down. Holy Pandas have kind of flooded the market. So, with Yak Pandas and Holy Jesus Switches and even the drop Holy Pandas are coming out soon. We're starting to see it's starting to become, I guess, less relevant.
So exactly. That's what I'm hoping for.
Those can be difficult because you kind of do have to have two different parts. And so, when you look at something like the Zelio V2, you're like, yeah, that's perfect. Like it's a Zelio V2. Like that's all I have to do is buy that. So, I think if the Zelio V2 like sounded just a little bit better or sounded closer to Holy Panda, I probably wouldn't ever buy a Holy Panda anymore. I think I'd probably just buy like 500 Zelio V2s and be done with that. Yeah. So, but yeah, I think we're starting to see the end of that hype.
Yeah. No, Zelio definitely has a larger, rounder, more defined bump. It might even be a little bit longer too. Mm-hmm. It feels more pleasant and it feels more consistent. And Holy Pandas just don't have that consistency.
You just buy the Switch and it's there.
Yeah.
You don't have to buy two Switches from two different stores and make them. So.
Yeah, well, a lot of people actually don't know is the reason that Holy Pandas sound as intense as they do is the Halo True or Halo Clear stem is actually a little bit longer than the traditional MX stem because the overall spec on the original Switch is 3.6 millimeter full travel, whereas the Panda, like more traditional Cherry MX switches, have the 4 millimeter travel, which is way more common. And so the way they accomplish that is by having the pole of the Kale or Halo switches be a little bit longer, so that way when you bottom out, you're hitting the bottom sooner than you otherwise would. So people that actually bottom out their switches, which is admittedly probably most of the community, they hit that bottom sooner and harder than they otherwise would because it doesn't have the same feel as another MX switch. So fun fact for a lot of you out there that might not know that.
Yeah,
definitely sound very unique. It'll be interesting to see if anyone can make a stock Switch that sounds that same way as the Holy Panda does. Obviously, the Zelio V2, I would agree, is an incredible Switch and feels amazing. But yeah, that sound of the Holy Panda is very unique. It's kind of their signature at this point.
Yeah, so and stem swapping is not just exclusive to Holy Pandas. Stem swapping is just taking any stem and putting it in another another switch. So, I've tried like a Zelio stem. It's actually Anthony 001. I don't know if he spearheaded this, but he took a Zelio V1 and put it in a MX RGB MX Brown, and it was a really, really nice typing experience. I really, really enjoyed it. So, and then even like I was making Pacos, which is taking a Halo stem and putting it in a Novel Keys cream switch. And so I had these cream stems laying around and I decided to make an MX Black with a cream stem in it and really enjoyed it. I thought it changed the sound really, really well. But whatever feels good to you and sounds good to you is that's something that you should do. It's this whole part of stem swapping is supposed to be so that it feels best for you and your experience. So, I would just say if it feels good to you and sounds good to you, then do it.
Yeah. And we have some people that get even deeper than that. I know one of our kind of resident mad scientists in the Top Clack Discord, Walker, he goes as far as to swap leaves as well. So he'll build like an entirely new switch from the ground up with like a specific housing, a specific leaf, a specific stem, spring, and top. And then like maybe even throw like a couple different kinds of lube in different areas. And it's like, oh my God, like that's more work than I want to do, if I'm being honest. But like, I like knowing that there's some people that get so deep into it to where like, they'll discover something that is the next, Holy Panda, or hopefully better, something that just blows everything else out of the water. Because the Holy Panda was really successful because of the time that it was discovered, not necessarily because it's an amazing switch. It's not an amazing switch.
Yeah, I don't, I don't think if the Holy Pandas had come out like a year and a half later, around the same time like the Zelio V2 came out, I don't think that it would be like as everyone would be losing their mind about this switch. But, I do think, without the Holy Panda, we wouldn't have the Zelio V2. That's
very true.
And, it's kind of like in this community, if you're not really like moving forward, if you don't have anything to kind of strive for, then, we're not going to be seeing like really improvements on anything. And so, there are a lot of switches that a lot of people are kind of going after, for a long time. The Holy Panda was what everyone was striving for. And so with that, that kind of pushed all these new switches to come forward. And that's not anything that, we need to recognize that and then keep pushing forward. We need to have these great switches come out so that we can keep pushing forward.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, and I say this all the time, like it's all about the innovation. And if it doesn't work or it doesn't turn out quite the way that it's supposed to, then you can cross that off your list now. And now as a community, we know what may or may not be successful, and we can adjust and we can move forward and try different things. And, the only way to evolve in our community is just continuously trying new things and trying to push the boundaries of design, whether it's in keyboards or switches or whatever. You pick a piece of the hobby. And if we can further it, we should be, honestly, just because that's how we're going to grow together and evolve in the community and get this, a little bit more mainstream. I hate to use that term because that'll probably never really happen, but get us a little bit more out there and maybe not quite so much as a niche.
Yeah. So
get more support.
But
I will say, when are we gonna get a new bomb clicky switch? We haven't had a high super popular clicky switch come out since the Box Jade Navy. That was kind of like the last time that the clicky switches dominated the market.
I think I would say the clicky switches have probably never dominated the market, if I'm being honest. But it's just switch preference. I mean, more people, right. If you put a linear, a clicky, and a tactile in front of them, and they're part of this community, fewer people are going to be picking the clicky switch versus one of the other two. Linear and tactile are just way too popular. Linear wasn't even very popular up until a couple of years ago. It was just all about tactile switches. Mm-hmm. And now linear has really had a much, much higher ray of light now. And I really appreciate that as a linear lover myself. But clicky is just not not what it used to be, I guess.
Yeah, when I got into the community, I had like a Razer, or not even community, but when I got into mechanical keyboards, I had a Razer green clicky switch. And then when I started getting into customs, I remember I went with box whites because I really like clicky switches. And then, I feel like, myself and a lot of other people in the community, you kind of started moving towards tactile. And I really, I like tactile a lot more now. So, and there's nothing wrong with, clicky switches or anything like that. But, if you don't, you want to try different things. So, but I mean, if you want to use box navies, just make sure you're in your own zip code. Them off. So, but
they're pretty intense. That's for sure.
Yeah, they are.
But the click bar, though, I will say, is definitely the best clicky innovation that we've probably ever had in our modern keyboard community, at least, because click jacket switches like Cherry MX Blues and such are just not good, man. They don't sound good. They don't feel good. It's not a clever technology. And while it is actually probably, more evolved than something like a click bar, which is admittedly pretty primitive, like you just have the plastic slap against a piece of metal. Like it's really, really primitive. Yeah. But the result within a switch is really, really good. You get a very clean and precise sound that you can't get any other way for that cheap in our community. And it's awesome. I think the click bar switches are amazing. And Kale really did a great job on those, regardless of what people might say.
Yeah.
I'm excited to see what comes next. I think that's more of what I was saying, is what comes next for clicky switches, in terms of like, how do you expand on the click bar? Like, it would be cool to see the next step past that, because click bar is great, but it's kind of stagnated a little bit. I feel like
it has, but I feel like no one in the community cares enough to push it further.
Yeah.
Although I will say that if I had to guess, the next big thing with clicky switches are actually not going to be part of the Switch at all. I think we're going to start seeing more modern age solenoids.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like we've had in previous boards like Beam Spring and stuff, which are, legendary, quote unquote clicky keyboards in our community. I think solenoids are probably going to be something that are going to be pretty big in the future. And also, I know that Input Club is working on the Keystone line of keyboards, and that's going to include the Silo line of key switches that are done through Kale. And those are supposed to be pretty interesting because the Silo Beam is supposed to be kind of a modern day Beam Spring switch. So I'm really interested to see how that clicky technology actually can translate over to what they're trying to accomplish here, because I think that could be pretty groundbreaking. Although it's going to be a little limited in the way they're releasing it, but I'm on the lookout for that. Mm-hmm. Could be cool.
So too, I'm excited.
So yeah, getting back to, I guess, kind of switch modding, I would just say experiment. It takes like 5 seconds. Well, maybe not 5 seconds, but a couple of minutes just to swap out a quick spring swap or a quick stem swap or something, and be able to kind of test it and see if you like it. I know you're not going to be able to really see until you type on the full thing, but you might be able to just see, kind of how tactile it is or something. And, especially with like Halo stems, I doubt there's a single switch that someone hasn't just thrown a Halo stem in that is compatible. I'm pretty sure ever since, the Holy Panda craze happened, I'm sure one of the first things that people do with a lot of new switches is throw in a Halo stem and see if it's the next Holy Panda. But, try things out, share your experience, kind of be a scientist in the community. You want to take your experiments, share them with people, swap out stems, swap out springs, because outside of, lubing's a little bit more difficult to kind of just quickly test, but outside of lubing, swapping out stems and swapping out springs can really show kind of a big difference and in what it is and what the switch can be. And just because you don't, I've said this before, but just because it's not the greatest thing for you doesn't mean, just because it's not the greatest thing for everyone else doesn't mean it could be the greatest thing for you. So just keep trying, keep searching for your holy grail, and I think that will really help you. So
that's true. Yeah, this community is very biological, and obviously we all have different preferences. And you never, like you said, you never know what you're gonna like and hate until you try it. And unfortunately, that's kind of just the nature of this community. There's so much to try, especially these days. It didn't used to be like this 3, 4, 5 years ago. But nowadays, it's like there's so much to try and so many different combinations of things to try with so many different, plate materials and layouts and board materials and stuff. And it's like there's too much. And that's why meetups are always the answer these days.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Anything else y'all would like to add to the whole Switch modding conversation before we get into some other things?
No, I think we covered it fairly well.
Yeah. The only thing, I know I say this as a joke, but honestly, switch testers can help with your experimentation, like a lot.
You know, I always hear you say that. I'm going to fight you on that, just because now that I'm on the show, I have the ability to fight you on it in real time.
Last week, or during the stream this past Wednesday, I said, "Listen, you don't know the full feel of Switch until you put it on a board." I know that. I 100% know that, and I agree with that. So sorry to take the wind out of your sails on your.
Oh, darn it! You're supposed to.
On your fight,
on, man. You're supposed to throw down here.
Okay, we could throw down about them. But if you're experimenting, you just want to try one Switch. If you're like, okay, well, I'll take the Holy Panda and then I'll try a Holy Xanda. Like, you can put them side by side and for the most part be able to go, okay, I know that that's different from that. So, you know, or I know, that's not as tactile.
Yeah, it'll definitely give you at least a vague idea of what you're about to be in for. But I've been on the receiving end of only negative feelings because of Switch testers. Mm-hmm. Switch testers have ruined me. They've murdered my family and like hit my dog.
and I will support them into the grave.
No, but I did this with when I was much newer to the community, and I got a Cherry MX Switch tester. It had MX Blues on it, it had MX Clears on it, and a few others. And I was pressing things like the MX Blue and Green and Clear, and I was like, oh, I like these. These are pretty good. Got a full board of them. Hated it. Absolutely hated it. And I was like, where did I go wrong? And I took my Switch tester, I just threw it out my window.
And that's how, so same thing with me. I got Zelio 62, 67, and 78. And I was like, oh, I like 67 the most. It's the most tactile because the lighter spring gives a little bit more tactility. And I started typing on it. I was like, this is great. And then I tried 78 and I was like, this is so much better. Now I have to desolder all these freaking switches because I like typing on the 78. So it's like, yes, some switches might, but what I will say is you might be able to, if you're looking at buying a bunch of switches, or if you're looking at potentially spending a lot of time lubing a bunch of switches, and you want to try like one or two compared to something that's already good, you might save yourself some time. You might go, okay, you know what? No, that's absolutely garbage. Like I tried that. I put a Halo stem in a phase switch, and I was like, oh, I wonder if this will be good. And I was like, nope, not even a little bit. So I was like, glad I didn't waste 45 minutes of my life doing this because I only built one and I put it next to something else. So sorry that Switch testers murdered your family.
And they hit my dog. But no, and this community is one where you really do have to invest time and money on some level of both just to really kind of understand what you might like and dislike. I think, and I'm gonna throw out the term endgame right now just because I freaking hate the term endgame the way it's used in this community. I think nobody really understands, and they just kind of use it haphazardly. But that's how we get people that get to their second keyboard and go, "This is my end game." Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, have you experienced literally everything the community has to offer? Do you know exactly how much you like and dislike everything this community has to offer? Because if you haven't, then I don't think you found your end game yet. Mm-hmm. And it's funny because you see these people that just they get their their Ducky Mini or their Woz code or whatever the popular OEM keyboards are these days, with their stock MX switches, and they throw on their Taihao keycaps, and that's fine if you like it, cool, whatever. But there is so much to experience beyond that. And it's like their second keyboard, I'm like, bam, this is my end game. And then they get their next keyboard and they try it and they go, now this is my end game. And it's like, how do you have an end game for every keyboard? Like, that's not how this situation works. And I feel like switches are kind of in the same vein too. Like, you never know what you're going to like most until you try it all. So I'm not going to claim that I've tried it all because I've so far from that, just like everyone else in the community. No one's tried everything ever. Like, that's just not how this works.
Think about it. Like, just on novel keys, there's 12 lubes or something like that. So if you just take like an MX Black, for example, that's 12 different feelings of a switch that you can get out of that. And then, when you factor in like springs, there's a bunch of different spring weights. So you kind of have to test all of these things. And that's, there's no way anyone's ever been able to test everything.
And it gets even worse than that, because springs and having different spring weights, like having two springs that are the same weight per se, can still be wildly different. You can get two different manufactured 78 gram springs, and they can feel very different, because the only thing that's consistent between them is that the full compression force is 78 grams. Yep. Everything else can be wildly different, and it can give you an entirely different experience in every single switch that exists. So it's like the possibilities they're limitless. They really are limitless now. Like, there's no one that's just going to have tried everything.
Yeah, I think.
Well, not to mention the human factor of your things that you like and that you enjoy change over time. Like, I'm sure your favorite switch when you first started is not your favorite switch now. Not to mention the fact that new things come out all the time. Like, people are always innovating things. And so it's like, there's never really a true end game.
Yep.
Yeah. So don't use that word. All of you. Don't.
If you say you have an end game, go to a meetup and type on everything, because you'll type on a board that you like more than whatever your end game is.
Yeah. If you say, I'm going to find you at a meetup if you use the term end game, and I'm going to sit you down and lecture you individually. And I don't want to do that, because that's going to take up a lot of my time that I could be lubing switches.
There you go. So speaking of lubing, I don't know if this is something you have lubed, but so we are changing keyboard of the week, but we've had a few guests on here now. So, I guess it's a tradition now. 3 or 4 makes it a tradition, is showing off the keyboard of the week. So, Brian, as our guest keyboard of the week.
Yeah, so I'm always down to show off my cool keyboards, because why else would we in this hobby? Let's be honest. But so I'm gonna flex some all palm Sirius on you guys right now. This is the Sirius 60, a 60% by Project keyboard, and this is actually currently my favorite board, and has been since I built it. It's all palm. There's no metal going on in there. There is a brass weight internally that's being kind of held down a little bit by the rest of the build, but other than that, all palm top, all palm bottom. This configuration actually doesn't have a palm plate, but my preferred configuration, which I don't have in here right now, does have a palm plate with palm switches, the Novel Keys creams. This version is not my favorite version of it, but it's still really good. This one has a carbon fiber plate, blue carbon fiber even. It's very, very pretty. As well as some lubed linear switches, or linear. I always forget how to say it. The IKEA switches, basically. And GMK side, a little bit of accent there. So this feels and sounds amazing. And it's quite good. Anyone that joined the Sirius group buy, I think you're going to be very happy with what you get.
Listening to you talking about it and looking at it, it makes me
FOMO.
Regret not getting in on it, because there was multiple times where I was like, man, I should get on that, but didn't.
I really do think it's going to be in contention for board of the year.
Wow. That's a bold statement.
Yeah.
Halfway through the year. That's awesome.
Yeah. There are other boards I'm looking out for as well. The Polaris by AO3, I think, is probably going to be another one that has the potential to go up there.
We are very excited about that.
Yeah. And then the Thermal from Wilbatech, I think that's going to have a lot of potential as well. There's a lot of cool boards on the horizon, but it's funny, because I build these like boards on like Keycolt from TGR. I just did one yesterday, and I have all these other awesome nice boards with finely tuned switches and stuff. And you know what I keep coming back to? The freaking Palm Sirius, because it just feels and sounds so much better than everything else that I've tried, and it's like so much cheaper than almost everything else I've tried.
Yeah, it's perfect example of expense doesn't equal quality 100% of the time.
Exactly.
Preference.
Yeah.
Yeah. I try to use experience per dollar as a better metric than anything else.
So, real quick shout out to our sponsors, switchmod.net. You can go to switchmod.net/Mechs on deck for 4% off any lubes. We've talked a lot about lubing today, so if you want to go grab some lube from them, you get 4% off. Once again, that's switchmod.net /Mechs on deck. That link will be in the description. And Zap Cables, we still have our Zap Cables is still going on. So you can use promo code Mechs on deck, and that's 10% off your DIY kit. We have a video that we just did that you can look up on our channel to search how to do it. That does end tomorrow, June 25th. So remember, promo code Mechs on deck gets you 10% off that kit.
Yeah, absolutely. Quakemz, we appreciate you coming by, talking a little bit about switch modding. You're definitely like the godfather when it comes to this topic, I feel like. So
that is very kind of you. I appreciate that, guys. It's been an absolute pleasure. I love doing this kind of stuff.
Awesome. So
yeah, be on the lookout for more stuff from him. I know that they've been streaming a lot. If you want to do your plugs of your different stuff, you can go ahead and do that now.
Yeah, so you can find me over at twitch.tv/TopClack. We are live every Thursday at 6 p.m. Pacific time. We do our primary show. It's a very news and discussion centric show that usually ends with a Q&A. Talk a lot about news topics, all sorts of stuff like that. We do build streams periodically every Sunday, and as of lately, every Friday pretty much too. So make sure to check that out. You can go to topclack.com. That's kind of a central hub where you can find everything involving us. You can join our official Discord, hang out there, do all that fun stuff. There's something for everyone.
Yeah. And we'll put the links to all that stuff down in the description below.
Heck yeah. Plug-in. I love plug-in.
I love plug-in. So,
all right, Chewy, close us out.
Well, thank you, Brian. It's going to be rare. Hopefully not too rare. But rare that we have such a great collection of beards here on a keyboard channel.
I should have tidied mine up a little bit more before the stream.
I haven't.
I just spilled water on myself too.
Let it go,
this is such a professional stream. I just realized I was actually wearing an accidental perfect shirt for this. So I know you guys are set up. You guys can't really see it right now, but it says, I got 99 problems, but a Switch ain't one. And it's a picture of a Switch. Perfect. This was totally accidental. It was just the first shirt I grabbed when I woke up. So that's kind of funny and ironic.
Yeah,
in a good way.
Yeah, so thank you guys for stopping in. Glad to be back on the weekly show. If you want to catch us live on Twitch, we go live Wednesdays at 8 p.m. Central. And then this video that went up today goes up at 11 a.m. Central Time. So be sure to subscribe. Be sure to follow us on Twitch. Be sure to check us on Discord. Be sure to check out Top Clack. We'll put the links in the description as well. So I want to say thank you one more time to Quakemz from Top Clack. It has been a pleasure to have you. So thank you.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
Get a Switch tester.
Don't get a Switch tester.